I just would like to take the opportunity to walk you through a Lightroom Classic workflow. Now, I've imported these images and we're looking at them in grid view in the library module of a Lightroom Classic. Now, if I just double click on the first one in the grid, I'm going to go into the loop view. Now, as I move forward looking for the pics, the best shots in this group of images I've captured, I am going to stay in the library module. If you move prematurely into the develop module, you will slow down because the standard previews that were built as the files were imported only service the library module. You do force Lightroom Classic to generate new previews if you go into that develop module. So just stay in the library module as long as you can after the import process. Now, I'm looking for images where I've caught the dog's attention, so I'll just move forward using the forward arrow key. I'll just bypass this one. This one's looking pretty good. I might just give this 1 star because the head is raised. This one looks a little bit similar, so I'll just pass this one over. This one's looking up, but maybe I've just got the ear a little bit too close to the top of the frame in this one. And looking down, and now we're looking towards the camera. I'll give that 1 star. Directly at the camera, that's what I'm looking for, 1 star. And maybe I'll just pass that one over. This one's quite cute looking down, so I'll take that one as well. Again, looking at the camera, 1 star. And I don't have the dog's attention here or here. This one's quite good with the paw raised. I'll just give that 1 star, and that completes the process. I'll go back to grid view by pressing the G key on the keyboard. Now with the filter bar available at the top, I'm just going to look at the rated images I've selected. So I've already narrowed that down. So you can sort of compare images at this stage now. So I'm looking for images where the dog is looking at the camera or very close to the camera. So I'll just select this one, holding down the command key, that would be the control key on a PC, just selecting another one and this third one here, and we can go into the compare view. So I'm looking for the ones which I definitely have the best attention of the dog, and that's quite clearly the one on the right. If I want to see these images larger, I can just press the tab key on the keyboard to hide those 2 panels, left and right. Now I'm just going to press the 2 on that right one, and I think that's probably the best one with the 2 stars. So I'll come back to the grid view now. We can do that with another couple of the images, so I could take 1, 2 and possibly 3 now here and compare those, looking for the best one. Go back into compare view. I do like this one, even though the ear is quite close to the top, so I'll take that as a 2, and I like this one looking down, so I'll take that as a 2 as well and exit that now. So going back into grid view, I can now filter for 2-star shots. Okay, so once we've got those 3 2-star shots, I'm going to now proceed into the develop module. So I'll just go into the develop module with this one. There will be a pause while it rebuilds the thumbnail. Rather than showing you editing this from scratch, I actually have got a snapshot from a version that I've edited previously. One of the things I would like to point your attention over, however, is in the basic panel. You'll see I've got a bit of a dog leg of the sliders here. That's because I've overridden the default develop import for a particular type of import that I'm looking at. This is it is possible to override the default develop, and I'll possibly do this in a future seminar. So what we've got, these are the default settings, which is highlights down, shadows up, a small exposure boost there, and some vibrance as well. You'll also see in the detail panel I've raised from the standard 40 sharpening to 75 with masking 75 as well. So once we've done this, I will then process the 2-star images I've selected. So I'll just go into the edit, and this is obviously a little bit of a tighter crop and also quite a heavy vignette there in the effects panel. I've come down from my -10 default to a -30 or so. I'm really trying to darken the corners so to get rid of any distractions in that background. So let's go back to grid view, and I'll do the same thing with one of these. I'll just press the D key to jump directly into the develop module, and I'll take my edited version. Again, you can see I'm really darkening the edges of the frame here to get some nice portraits going. I can come over and just raise that, so rather than going back to grid view, I can pick up the film strip on the bottom there to advance that way. And again, I'll just apply the previously edited version to this. Okay, now that I've got the three 2-star edited files, I might decide to label them all as 3 stars, which is typically what I do if I've picked them. I've narrowed down to a 2-star pick and then edited, then they become a 3-star image. Now what I'm going to do with these 3-star images, I'm going to go up to the library menu here and convert photos to DNG. And now this is what I will do prior to putting these in Adobe Creative Cloud. Now that the files have been converted to DNG files, I'm now going to back them up via Adobe's Creative Cloud using the Lightroom CC application. Let's just exit full screen on this one and move that over to one side. Now I'll select these 3 images and I'll click and drag them over to my Add to LRCC folder there. Now what I'll do is I'll come over and open Lightroom CC, and what I will do now is I'll just go full screen here and click Add Photos. Now it's already targeted this Add to LRCC folder which I have on my desktop, and I'll just go to Review for Import. These are the 3 images. I can just add to album, select none here, but if I've got a particular album I know these are going towards, I can select this from now. For instance, I've got an album called Dogs here, and I can add them directly to that album as well. So I'll just click Add 3 Photos. Okay, so these are the 3 photos. You'll see that the cloud icon in the top right hand corner now here is syncing with Adobe Creative Cloud. So I know these files are going to be safe. Okay, and that's a great thing about the cloud service. Yes, I'll create a second backup on my RAID drive here at home, but I know now a third version of these files is going up to the Creative Cloud. Now I will be able to access these files on any device running Lightroom CC, and that includes a tablet or my mobile phone. So this is a great way of sharing your best images with friends and family and colleagues as well. Okay, so that sort of concludes my Lightroom Classic and Lightroom CC workflow. I should also add that once you've imported your images into Lightroom CC and they are synced up with Adobe's Creative Cloud, a local version is also saved to the default location you've specified in the preferences. So already you've essentially backed that file up one time. Now if I just double click on any of the thumbnails I've just imported, you'll see that I'm in the develop module of Lightroom CC, and anything that I've used to edit the image inside of Lightroom Classic I have access to in Lightroom CC, and that goes for even your iPhone or your tablet as well. We've got a fully featured raw file that we can access via any device that we're currently using, and those edits always are synchronized in Lightroom CC. I don't use the sync service in Lightroom Classic. The full versions of the raw files are not uploaded from Classic, so I much prefer to transfer them over and import them into Lightroom CC. Lightroom CC always preserves the full resolution raw file, and that is the advantage to the workflow that I've just outlined. Of course, with this thumbnail here I can drag it into multiple albums. I'm not restricted just a single album. So for instance, I could drag this into my folio album there as well. And of course what we have the option of any album is we can share and invite users to look at the images from the album that we've created. So this is a great service via the Lightroom CC application. So having CC on a desktop computer is also a great way to look at your workflows as well as running Classic. Let me quickly take you through this panoramic workflow in Lightroom Classic, where I'm going to merge 3 vertical images to create a wide panorama. Now you'll see that I've taken these images in vertical orientation. That will give me maximum foreground and additional information in the sky, rather than doing a panoramic merge using horizontal format images. Now merging these 3 images using the 20mm f1.8G should give me an angular view of somewhere between 12 and 14 millimeters if I'm using a 50% overlap. 50% overlap is easy because whatever is in the center of one image goes to the edge of the next image that you're going to create. Now if you've got a lot of foreground information like I have in these 3 images, you really want to offset the camera on the tripod using a nodal slider. Now if you're going to put the camera in vertical orientation, it also helps to have an L bracket or L plate attached to the camera. If you don't have that foreground information, you can actually do this handheld. The camera doesn't need to be on a tripod if you don't have any immediate foreground information. So let's go back into the grid view. I'll click on the first image in the sequence, and then holding down the shift key I'll click on the last image in the sequence, and then I'll right click and choose photo merge panorama. You'll also see there's a HDR option where you can merge bracketed images. Now if you want the maximum quality, I would probably recommend shooting 5 images one stop apart. I will often start my HDR images with a negative exposure because I don't want to put too many overexposed files into that sequence. Okay, so let's choose panorama in this instance. The dialog box will open, and I'll have a number of different options up there on the top right hand side. I'm going to click off the auto crop and the auto settings so you can see what is happening with the stitching. Now we've got 3 options: spherical, cylindrical and perspective. You'll get the maximum perspective by using the perspective option, but you will get a lot of information dragging in the corners, and that might lower the quality of the information in those corners if you use this option. Cylindrical, it doesn't give you that wider image in this instance, so I'm going to go for the first option, spherical, for that more panoramic view there. Now we can crop the image, or we can go for this boundary warp. Now this may not work if you've got architectural detail in the corners, but if you're working just with a natural landscape, we can actually stretch the image out on the edges to so we don't actually have to crop at all. So this is the setting I'm going to use in this instance. I'll click on the auto settings here, and then click on the merge. Now as that merges, obviously this might take a little bit longer if you're working with 50 or 60 megapixel images. I'm working with 24 megapixel images in this instance, so even then we're going to create a 50 megapixel raw file from this stitch. Let's just double click there. You'll see in the info section this is a DNG. This is still a raw file format, so this will still take a lot of post-production editing. So if I'm not completely finished with this image now, I can take that into the develop module. I'll just collapse that panel on the left side there, so we got a maximum screen preview. Now I do want to darken the sky a little bit more, so I'll just come into the graduated filter there. I'll double click the word effect just to zero all of those sliders. Then I'll drag that down by maybe a stop and a third, and then click and drag that through the image. Now this will darken the foliage on the side as well, but we can limit that either by raising the shadow slider or by coming down into the range mask and choosing luminance, and then just dragging the bottom of that range up by 30 or 40 levels, so we're not darkening the darkest tones in the image, we're just darkening the midtones and highlights now. So I'm just going to apply that. I do notice this is a little bit crooked. I wasn't working with a leveling base on this mini tabletop tripod, so I will need to straighten this image as well. I can just do a freehand straighten, or I can use the angle tool to drag along that horizon line that I can see there, and that will straighten the image nicely. It just looks a little bit crooked in the center, so I might just do a freehand straighten there just to get that building straight in the middle. Okay, and then I'll apply that crop. Now I'm going to open up the shadows even more, so I've got a little bit more detail. If I'm opening up the shadows and dragging down the highlights a long way, I do like to add a little bit of contrast. We've got a little bit of a gap on the right hand side of the histogram there, so I'll just hold down the Option key or Alt key on a PC and drag that white slider until we see some visible clipping, then backtrack. So this makes sure that I've got an absolute brightest white point within that image. Okay, so that really concludes the panoramic, and I'm now free to export that and upload it to social media. I'm in the Develop module of Lightroom Classic, and I want to show you how you can override Adobe's Develop default and create a new starting point that more suits your particular workflows. So if you cast your eye over to the basic panel, you'll see that I actually am using Adobe's default at the moment. All of the sliders are set to the middle position. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to make some preferred changes, and then when I'm importing images from this particular camera, they're always going to come up with my default rather than Adobe's default. So let's start the process. We're working with the Adobe color profile, but we don't have to use this profile. We can come over to the profile browser, and in the camera matching profiles I can pick one of the Sony camera matching profiles, such as camera neutral or camera standard. If you click on the top right hand corner of any of these become favorites that you can access more easily. I'll click the close and just show you that if I have marked some favorites, I can access them from the drop down menu here, such as here's the camera neutral. I'm going to leave it at Adobe Color for this time being. Okay, so let's start making some changes to the sliders. Now often when I'm working on location, I'm trying to protect some very bright highlights that might be in the background, I'll be lowering the exposure in camera. So I now want to correct that by just raising the exposure by 2/3 of a stop. What I did there was highlight the exposure field, and then holding down the Shift key I just press the up arrow on the keyboard twice to raise it by 2/3 of a stop. Now I'm going to bring down the highlights, again holding down the Shift key, pressing the down arrow key on the keyboard, and I'll wind in -60 on the highlights, and I'll put in +60 on the shadows. I'm going to come up to the contrast field now and add +20 contrast, +10 clarity, and +20 vibrance. So these are the new starting points. Now this won't suit every image, but this is going to be more closely aligned to what I typically do when I'm editing most of my images. So we don't have to just stop there. We can come down and, for instance, I can access the detail panel, and we've got a very conservative amount of sharpening, so I'm just going to raise that to +70. Now the masking slider, I would love Adobe to start with the masking slider in the middle, but there is no masking from the sharpening. This is where you hide the sharpening from the smoother areas of the image, such as sky or skin tones. We don't really need to sharpen those elements, so I would prefer to start with the masking slider much higher. To give you an idea, I'm just going to hold down the Option Alt key and raise that masking slider. This is called threshold view. The areas that are going black on the screen are the areas that are not going to be sharpened now. So you can see that I'm going to be sharpening the eyelashes and the hair and some of the texture on the fabrics, but I'm going to be preventing the sharpening happening on the skin texture. So 70 for me would be a much better starting point for most of the images I'm editing. So let's close that detail panel. I also actually prefer to add in a small amount of vignetting. I do like to darken the corners a little bit. I'm coming to the color priority and just winding that down to -10. Now obviously if you want a clean flat sky going into the corners of a landscape image, this is probably something you won't want to do, but I find myself doing it half of the time, so I'm going to add that to the starting point now. Now there are other things that you can add in for your starting point, but I've just touched on some of them now. So if this is where you're going to be wanting to starting most of the time, we're now going to come over and create a preset. I'm going to click on create preset, and I'm going to call this the A7R2 preset because that's the model of camera I'm using here. So you can go into the group called user presets, or you can create a new group here. Maybe I'll call it camera presets, and so I'll create that. Now you'll see that all of the checkboxes are checks, so I'm going to be applying this to the preset. So I'll hit the create now. Okay, we could for instance now hit reset. This is where the image came in, and I can now come over to my camera preset and click on A7R2, and there's all of the settings that I wound into that preset. But I want this to be happening automatically. I don't want to have to click on that preset every time I edit an image. So this is where we're going to come up to Lightroom Preferences. We're going to come up to the presets, and now I'm going to choose the camera A7R Mark II, and we're going to pick a preset from my camera and the A7R2, and we'll create that as the new default. So you can see I've already got defaults in this Lightroom catalog for my Alpha 1 and my Alpha 7C. Now I've created a third preset. These are camera specific profiles or presets, so they will override just the images to be edited from this specific camera. So you'll need one of these for each camera that you're using. And now we'll click OK. So now when I hit reset, you'll see that the sliders no longer zero out. They'll always go back to that new default. So I find that this is a much faster way of editing if half of the work is already done for me. Now of course I will need to fine tune each specific image, but I'm going to have to be moving far less sliders with this particular workflow. Now that we've created that new default, I'll just fine tune this image before continuing the edit. Just a little bit bright, I think, so I'll just come down a fraction. Now you will notice if you do want to zero out any of the sliders, if you double click the slider, it doesn't go to 0, it goes to your new default. So that is something to be wary of. Just taking that down a little bit, and what I'll do now is I'll just zoom in because I want to just work on these eyes a little bit. I'll come into the adjustment brush. Now I'll pick up one of the Adobe presets here, which is the Iris Enhance, and I'll just come in and wipe that over just to enhance the irises of each eye there. Now as I'm zoomed in, you'll probably notice that there's a felt hat here which has got lots of bits and pieces. Now you could go into this little tool and start removing each one speck at a time, but I think you'll be there for a very long time with that healing brush there, or the spot removal tool. So let's look at a better way of removing this. Okay, I'll just zoom back out. Now if you own or are leasing Lightroom Classic, then you also have access to Photoshop CC, and there are some things that are just so much faster to do in Photoshop CC than working in Lightroom. There are also obviously loads of things you can do inside of Photoshop that are just simply not possible in Lightroom. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click and go to Edit in Adobe Photoshop 2021. Okay, so that will take the image out into Photoshop, and I'll continue the editing from that point. With the image open inside of Photoshop CC, I'm just going to come over to the Layers panel. I'm going to right click on the background layer and choose Convert to Smart Object. Okay, when that process is complete, I'm going to proceed to the Filter menu and come down to Noise and choose the Dust and Scratches filter. Okay, so let's just zoom in so you can see what we've got here. Now, of course, we've lost the detail in the face, but I'm really coming to this filter just for the hat. Now you can see the felt hat has got absolutely no signs of specks or dust or hairs there. I'll just lower the two sliders so you can see how this filter works. We'll just put that down to 1 and the threshold down to 0. So the first thing we need to do is just raise the radius until we hide all of the dust and scratches. And so, yep, probably just slightly less than that will probably do. We really want to find the minimum radius that will remove 95% of the stuff that we're looking for. Now, of course, this texture or tone now is looking like a bit like extruded plastic. So by raising the threshold slider, we're going to build back in some of that texture. So if we go too far with the threshold, for instance, if we push it up there, you'll start noticing some of the dust and scratches starts reappearing. So there's a fine balance between radius and threshold. So I'll just lower that again, and we're getting close to the optimum settings for the two sliders now. So I'll click OK. Now, because it's being applied as a smart filter, we do have this mask available where we can shield areas that we don't want to apply the filter to. So what I'll do is I'll just click on that mask that goes with that dust and scratches. At any time, if I've decided I want to change my mind about those settings, I can simply double click the word dust and scratches and I can modify the settings applied to this filter. So I'll just cancel that out. Again, with that mask selected, I'm just going to go Command I on a Mac or Control I on a PC just to invert that. Now the filter is completely hidden from the entire image. So what I'm going to do now is come over to the Brush tool, select white as the foreground color. I'm going to be working at 100% opacity, and then I'm just going to brush over the hat with this filter. Okay, so we're just applying the filter in a localized manner. You might even find that it reduces some of the hairs, the flyaway hairs that we have in this image. Okay, like so. So you can see how much more quickly we can edit the image inside of Photoshop compared to trying to use the spot removal tool inside of Lightroom. I'll just zoom out a couple of times so we fit on screen again. There are, of course, some things that we can do inside of Photoshop that are just simply not possible. It's not just a question of time, they're just simply not possible. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down to my Actions panel here. I'm going to add a creative border to this image. So we're going to come down to Borders and Textures. I'm going to click on the white border and then click on the Play Action button here. Now this screen is inviting me to select a border file that I have on this computer. Now these files are available on my website. Just go to Downloads, Photoshop, Actions and look for the Borders action. So I'll hit Continue here. And now I'll navigate to my borders, which is a file on my computer. I'm choosing the ESP border 1, which is a white horizontal, and hit Place. Now, if the aspect ratio of your image is slightly different from this file, you may have to adjust the size or position of this file. But once you've got that into position, just say yes, I'm accepting that that is aligned with my host image, and I'll commit the transformation. It's that easy. Okay, and of course, because we're working with layers in Photoshop, this is something that is simply not possible in any of the raw editing programs, including Lightroom CC. So I'll just save this file, Command S, Control S on a PC, and then I'll close this file, Command W on a Mac or Control W on a PC. Now I'll come back over to my Lightroom Classic, and there is the image. You see it's been automatically imported back into my Lightroom catalog alongside the original file here that we took out. And so that is a great way of editing, is to take it out, save it at the default location inside of Photoshop. Don't choose a different location, just save it at the default location, and then Lightroom will automatically re-import that into your catalog to help you stay organized. Okay, let's take a look at an editing workflow for this action image. I'll just hide this panel on the left hand side so we get to see the dog as large as possible in the preview window. Now I'm going to hit reset and just basically start from scratch. I might not get to this exact point because each time you edit you perhaps never edit the same way twice. I can take you up to the information in the top left hand corner before we start. However, if you know my PAL workflow, portrait, action, landscape, I've got action on number 2 on the shoot mode dial, and these are my action settings: 1/2000th of a second. I'm using maximum aperture on the 100-400G master lens, and the ISO is on auto. The ISO auto minimum shutter speed of 1/2000th of a second is driving the shutter speed. Okay, so I'll be on a high drive mode, shooting at perhaps 20 frames per second. Probably don't need the high plus, maybe 30 would be a little bit of overkill in this instance. So let's take a look. You can see that there's not too much work on in the basic panel, and if you know that I override my default and lower the highlights, raise the shadows, you'll see that these are possibly very close to the defaults. So I'll just hit reset and see where we've come from. Okay, so these sequences of images were with the dog getting ever closer to me. So this one is needs to be cropped somewhat. What we're going to do now is just go straight into the crop marquee there, and we're going to start cropping. Now if I want this to go full screen on a 16:9 aspect ratio screen, I'll select the 16:9 aspect ratio now. Okay, so what we're going to do is just click and drag to drag this, and you can see that I've got it's a little bit crooked in the image, so I'm just going to rotate the dog a little bit straighter as well and put the dog in the middle of the frame. How close should I go? Well, of course we've got a little bit of flexibility, especially with an A1 file. So I'll just tap the I key a couple of times. Now we're coming down to resolution, and I'm going to be careful not to go below 3840 pixels wide, but I really won't need to crop that tightly because we've got plenty of megapixels. So this is coming down to like a 24 megapixel image sampled outside of the 50 megapixel master, and of course that is one of the great things about the Alpha 1, is having that rich resolution there. So I can press the R key on the keyboard just to exit that. Okay, so I'll just take a look, make sure that I'm comfortable with that crop, which I am, and then we'll move on to the next series or sequence of editing steps. Now you can see here are my defaults for -60 highlights, +60 shadows, +20, some vibrance as well, and I could add a little bit of clarity or texture just to highlight the texture on the dog there. So I'm going to open up the shadows a little bit more than the default I have here, maybe push it to 80 or 90, because we've got this dark hair in the dog and we do need to reveal a little bit more detail. You'll see also in my developed default I will have erased the sharpening as well. Okay, so there's a couple of things that I'm already wanting to do. You'll see this paw that's coming out is quite a lot brighter than the rest of the hair, and also the hair on the shoulder here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to come to an adjustment brush. I'm going to double click the word effect just to zero the slider, and then we're just going to, I'll just well, I was using an effect before, so I'll just go to exposure, and then we'll just lower that by maybe 0.6 of a stop. And with that brush, I'll just brush that over that foreground paw. If I need a slightly smaller brush, I'll just use the close square bracket key and just brush that down onto the shoulder there. Okay, so that's basically got what I want. Occasionally I'll do some lightening and darkening work using radial filters. So let's just have a look at that. I might click on that radial filter, double click the word effect. This time I'll raise it to +1/2 a stop, and then I'll just put that over the shaded side of the face here just to get a little bit more light in there. So that's an alternative way to using the adjustment brush for getting things lighter and darker. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the radial filter. This time I'm going to create quite a large radial filter. Now you see that's working on the inside. You see that brightening is working on the inside. What I want to do now is I want to start working on the outside. So I'm just going to click on that invert there, so that if I do any work now, you can see that it's working on the outside of that ellipse. So I'm just going to rotate this so it's in line with the dog there. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to darken slightly, and I'm also going to reduce noise on that outside area. It's not very noisy, I have to say, but I'm just going to create a smoother bokeh there by winding the texture down and winding the noise up. It's not very noisy, so I don't really need that much. But you can see with the exposure as well, just taking that down, it really brings in. It's an alternative to maybe applying a vignette, is you've got a little bit more control about exactly where you're darkening and lightening. Now I'm going to come to a couple of graduated filters. This time I'm going to use a negative value, and I'm just going to darken the top of the image there. And I'm going to drag another one up from the bottom of the image, much higher this time. We've got a patch of light grass running across here that I want to darken, so I need to move the transition point up to above where that light patch is. Okay, I can control color as well down below. I can, for instance, make that a little bit warmer down below, and yep, I think I quite like that, and maybe add a little bit of tint as well. So you're not restricted just with exposure with these graduated filters and radial filters. You can wind in a few more adjustments as well. I might even wind in a little bit of saturation. Okay, so I'm reasonably happy with that image. If I arrive at that point and I'm happy, what I'll often do is create a new preset. I'll just a new snapshot. What I'll do is I'll just do a Command N, Control N on a PC. That brings up the preset, and by default you get a date and time that you're creating this preset, or you can override this, and I'll call it my Edit 2. Okay, so let's hit create. So now what we can do is we can cycle between the two edits and maybe choose which one I prefer best. Okay, so I actually think I prefer the second one. It's just a little bit darker behind the dog. Okay, I can carry on fine-tuning this, for instance. Let's just hide that panel a minute. I noticed that I could optimize a white point for this by holding down the Option key, dragging that white slider until we get some clipping. You see the teeth clipping first, so then just wind back so there's no clipping, and now we've set an optimum white point as well. Might just go a little bit brighter on this image just for a little bit more drama. If you want to override the preset, you can just right click on the preset and choose Update with Current Settings. Okay, so that concludes the action edit of Izzy the dog. Let's take a look at a workflow for converting an image from color into monochrome or black and white. Now this is going to be a little bit of a portrait exercise as well. So I haven't edited this image for quite a while. It must be more than 8 months before I first edited this image. So I might not get through to the snapshot that I've got here. There's always a chance that it'll look slightly different with any edit. Okay, so that's the great thing about snapshots is you can just cycle between one and another each time you edit, and you can then just choose your favorite edit. So let's start by hitting the reset here. And of course it's not monochrome, it's color image. So let's just we'll go to fit in view so you can see the whole frame there. I have turned the camera into vertical orientation. I don't always do this with the R cameras. I'll often take out a vertical portrait from a landscape composition, but here I'm working with the Alpha 7C and the 85mm f1.8 at maximum aperture. Now the location is a cafe. We've got window light coming in from the left side here. Now I wasn't originally sitting with Andrew when I decided on the vantage point. I actually changed positions so I could have the lighting striking Andrew's face at one side. Okay, so the pose is natural. I didn't ask him to pose in any particular way, but the hand in the frame is a really good posing technique if you do want to get a sitter more comfortable, because often people really don't know what to do with the hand, so you might have to make a suggestion. So let's take a look at the edit first off. Okay, so we'll come into the basic panel, and I'll just choose black and white. Well then, you see the defaults are my defaults for this particular camera, which are not all zeroed out, but in this instance the exposure is too high, so I'll just bring that back down to 0. I'll increase the contrast, which is often what I like doing with some black and whites, and we've got some very bright highlights that need to come down, so I'll bring that all of the way in this instance. Then we'll come into the crop, and you'll see that I've got the golden ratio here, not the rule of thirds, and this is my preferred overlay if I am going to use an overlay for that composition. And I'll just center Andrew in the frame here. We'll get rid of that arm in the bottom left hand corner as well, and I might need to go a little bit tighter. And of course we're getting the intersection points right on the pupils of the eye, so that's almost the perfect composition for this portrait, and we'll just commit that. Now that I can see the general exposure of this, I can play around with starting black and white profiles. We don't have to accept Adobe monochrome. There are plenty of black and white profiles to choose from. So let's just go in and click on the profile browser and come down to the black and white. You can just cycle over the thumbnails looking for your preferred. I actually quite like 3 there, and 6 gives me a lot of detail in the skin, but I think 3 gives me a little bit more contrast. Okay, so a little bit too bright and a little bit too flat. 11, I think it's going to be 3. So we could look at 3. If I don't have 3 listed as a favorite, I can just click on that star in the upper right hand corner, and then we can close the panel. And now I could perhaps cycle between Adobe monochrome and version 3 and just choose my favorite there. So I'm going to go with the black and white 3 profile in this instance. You've also got this slider which you can increase or decrease the strength of that profile if you like. Okay, so once we've done that, the shadows is a little bit open as the starting point, which is often what I'm doing when I'm working in contrasty situations. But in this instance, I'm going to lower the shadows because I want to darken the background behind Andrew here, and that does a really good job, except for that little pool of light in that top left hand corner. I might be able to manage that with dragging the post-crop vignette a little bit darker. If that doesn't get it all of the way, which is, I don't want to darken the arm too much in the bottom right here, so I'm going to finish that off with an adjustment brush with, just double click 0, with -1 stop, increase the size of the brush, and then just paint that distraction out. I'm just going to create a new adjustment brush this time, raise the exposure. I'm just going to put a little bit of extra light just on the cheek, on the shaded side there, just to sort of enhance that side of the face just a little bit. Okay, just take a little bit off the exposure off there. Then I'm going to drag a little bit of that exposure onto the eyes, like so, just to bring those alive. Okay, so I'm really quite like that approach now. So let's just go back to the basic panel, and I'm going to bring the white slider down a little bit. The whites here are just a little bit hot, I think, so we're just bringing that down a little bit more, and maybe open up. Yeah, just very minor adjustments have a huge impact, I'm noticing, on the face here. So what I'm also going to do, I'm going to just brighten this side of the face, I think, a little bit lighter on that side of the face. Okay, so like so, maybe as much as half a stop, just to remodel that face across there. Okay, I'm really happy with that now. I might just do one more localized adjustment with a brush, negative value, and just move that across that foreground hand there. Now I'm working with the adjustment brush with auto mask switched off. When you've got gradual transitions from light and shade, you're not trying to stay behind a very definite edge, it's worth working without the auto mask on. Okay, so now I'm happy with that. I'm going to just zoom in a couple of times. There are some little specks on the face that I might want to remove. A couple of things that are not permanent fixtures on the face, but are very minor distractions. There's just a couple there on the side of the face. Often you'll need just to move the selection or sample point so you get the right skin being populated in the area you're removing. We've also got a little bit of a hair running along here, which is a little bit distracting, so I'm just going to remove that, and again probably repositioning that so we've got appropriate skin texture running down there on that forehead. And there's a couple more on the nose, very minor things, you might not even notice them when I zoom out, but I'm going to remove them anyway. And one more on the bridge of the nose there, and just that little right in the corner of the eye, and I think we're done. So I'll just go to fit on screen, and I think that is a good black and white portrait conversion of Andrew now. There's also a little speck on the hand, which I'm not too sure whether that's a permanent fixture, but I think it's a little bit distracting, so I'm just going to remove that from view now. Go back to fit again. Yep, I think I'm happy with that, so create a new preset. So I'll call this my edit V2 and hit create, and then I could cycle between what I did many months ago and a little bit darker on this side of the face on this one, but otherwise quite similar. A little bit more contrast with this one, a little bit more light on the light side of the face. I think I'm preferring the second version so now, and I've just seen another fleck, so just go up into the hairline and just take out that small fleck, that distraction. That's a good repair, and back out, and we're good to go. Okay, let's take a look at editing this portrait. I'll just show you the finished version before we get into the actual edit. Okay, so I captured this outside of a temple in Japan. Okay, so I'll take your attention up to the info section in the top left hand corner. I've modified what you actually see in the info. This is possible just by going to the view menu, view options, and you can see here that I've changed what I might normally have there to exposure bias, just so I can showcase what I've been doing in the exposure compensation dial in the camera. So I'll just close that down. Now what happens with very dark backgrounds is often the camera will increase the exposure to lighten the overall exposure to create an average. The danger of doing this with very dark backgrounds is you can actually lose the highlights. So when I'm working with Zebra's 109 plus lower limit, it's always going to give me an early warning to say that I'm at risk of clipping the highlights. So I've lowered the exposure by 2/3 of a stop so that I'm not going to clip those highlights. If we hit the reset, you can see that it is sailing very close to the wind here. Those highlights on the right side of the face here are very, very bright. If I just grab the highlight slider in the basic panel, you'll see that there's still plenty of information. So I have managed to nail the exposure in this instance. Just be wary of when you do have very light backgrounds, it's most likely you're going to be underexposing if you don't use the exposure compensation dial, and if you've got very dark backgrounds, then that's the most important thing, is you don't clip the highlights so they're irrecoverable. There is a little bit more headroom, of course, for the raw shooter to be able to restore highlights which are a little bit too bright. Okay, so the lighting of this is pretty much perfect, I have to say. If I just lower the highlights here, already this that isn't a lot to do. The lighting on this is great because we're getting that sort of open door light. So there will be a roof over the porch or veranda area, which is stopping the skylight from coming down and creating dark wells in the eyes. So all of the skylight is being forced to come in at sort of our level, if you like. So we're getting this really beautiful lighting. You can see underneath the chin, for instance, there's light on the neck, and we're getting a nice modeling because the face is turned slightly away from the light. So you'd be hard pressed to light this with flash any better than what I've got here, which is why I love this style of natural lighting. So I'm just going to open up the shadows. If you wanted a really dark studio background, we could really create sort of a low-key looking image here, but there's actually some interesting things in the shadows, and that is some of these paintings of the characters. The Japanese characters here are really quite nice to look at inside of those shadows. So opening up the shadows and bringing the highlights down. Now you will notice there's a gap in the extreme right hand corner of the image. Now 80-90% of the time I'm setting a white point. This is going to be one of those instances where if I do set a white point for this image, it's going to look a little bit unnatural. I'll just show you that. I'll grab the white slider and move that up to we just start to see clipping in the face. And if I just bring that down, you'll see that the highlights on the face, on the cheek and the nose just look a little bit unnatural. They're just a little bit too bright. What we don't really want in this image is a white point that's on the face. So this is going to be one of those instances where the white point will be best left at 0. And if we do need the image any brighter, use the exposure slider. But as I do that, the highlights are getting brighter again, so I will need to come down with that highlights. Okay, so the only thing that I might want to do is just put a little bit of extra light in the eyes. I'll just double click the word effect, raise that to maybe half a stop exposure, and just wind that over the eyes there. I'll just hold down the option key. I don't want to remove any of the light that I've just added from the upper lids there. So let's just go in and do that one more time. So the light is really only going into the eyes. You've got basically a light switch with each of these panels that you can toggle on and off. So you can see a before and after of just that localized adjustment if you want. I'm really quite happy with this image. I do notice there's a couple of flecks on the on the tunic here, so I'll just come in and remove those because they are slightly distracting on the fabric, and the more I look the more I see. So I'm just going to remove a couple more, and one on the side here and one over here. Now occasionally you will need to reposition one of these points because Adobe will sample an inappropriate area for that spot removal. Okay, so that really concludes. Not really much to do here, so I'm more than happy with the edit of this image. Let's take a look at editing a landscape image. You may have seen me use this image to promote the Patreon support service. This was captured at one of the bends on the rivers looking towards the Grand Tetons in the USA. Now it's a fabulous still morning view. You'll see another photographer on the riverbank on the right side, just above the mist there. I actually don't mind including the human figure in a landscape. I do think it gives a sense of scale sometimes to some of these grand vistas, but it would also be quite easy to remove with the spot removal tool if that wasn't to your liking. So let's take a look at the edit. First of all, in the info you'll see that it's a 10-second exposure, f11, ISO 100. I didn't really have to worry about hyperfocal distance or anything because there's nothing in the immediate foreground, and so at the 45mm focal length I don't need to stop down more than f8 or f11. Okay, so I am using an ND filter of course to create a much smoother reflection in the water. You don't often need anything more than say 4 or 5 seconds, but this is a 10-second exposure. So without much further ado, we'll just hit the reset. Now you'll see on the reset options here it doesn't go back completely to 0 because I'm using an Adobe default, a custom default to override the Adobe default for the develop module for this specific camera. This was the Alpha 7R3. So let's first thing we'll do is we'll do a crop. So we'll just click on the crop overlay there, or you press the R key. I'm going to go into the 16:9, which is a favorite aspect ratio for my landscapes because it will go full screen on a monitor or a TV. And then it's got a little bit of a crooked approach to this, so I'm just going to straighten this and maybe raise the mountain just to put it on the overlay here. If you are using those overlays, you can press the O key on the keyboard to cycle through, so you can find the center of the image, for instance, and you might choose to put the horizon on the center line, but I'm going slightly lower here, and I'll carry on pressing the O key just to show you. Here is the golden ratio. So the golden ratio is sometimes used for landscape work. It's probably a little bit friendlier than say the rule of thirds when we're doing these landscapes, so I might go and use that golden ratio in this instance, putting the top of the river onto that lower line there. So let's commit that. We can press the R key on the keyboard again to go into that. Now I'm going to do some graduated filters first off. So let's just go into the graduated filters there, press M on the keyboard to fast track that. I'm going to use quite a heavy graduated filter, so let's just bring down maybe a stop and a half. Now if you drag very short graduated filters, they will be noticeable, so you can just create one very long graduated filter going all of the way down to the horizon line. I might bring this one a little bit lower, however, and also cool that graduated filter down so we get a richer blue sky there. Okay, so let's add a new one. This time we'll come in from the bottom of the image up to the top. Now I'm going to increase the saturation, okay, in order to and maybe it's a little bit strong as well. I'm also going to add some clarity here just to get a little bit more definition in the water. Now with those, I think what this image is really crying out for is a little bit more color. So I'm going to ramp up that vibrance maybe as high as 50 or 60 here, and also brighten the image. The image will take quite a lot of brightening now. I've got those graduated filters. I'm always open to sort of changing my mind with some of the filters. So I'll go back to that graduated filter. Maybe bring this one a little bit lower, and also add some clarity to that filter, and also add another new graduated filter, this time maybe just half a stop at the top of the image. Go a really nice dark Ansel Adams sky there, and again if I want a little bit more color in there I can do that. So one of the things that you will notice about these graduated filters is they will darken light clouds. So if you're wanting to restrict one of these graduated filters and have the brighter clouds really pop, you can come to the range mask, and what you can do is click on luminance, and you can brighten some of those whiter clouds there. So we're just darkening the blues. So this will encourage me now to move the exposure slider even further down, because I am keeping some of these clouds quite bright. I might do the same thing with the top graduated filter as well, just luminance, and bring in just to lighten some of these clouds in that structure there. Okay, so I think also the color temperature could be a little bit warmer. So let's just push that up a little bit, and also I'm just going to raise the saturation slider. And sometimes when warm colors are a little bit slow to get a little bit more vibrant, you get a little bit of a faster reaction by dragging the saturation. The vibrance is usually the default one. It ensures that colors don't pop out of the color gamut too soon. But of course some of the oranges, some of the warmer tones do need a little bit of help with the saturation slider. What I'm going to do now is just come to the adjustment brush. Just a small negative exposure, quite a lot of clarity, and what I'm going to do is just come into the base of this mountain here, which is just getting a little bit light in tone. So I'm just going to wipe that over the base of the mountain and also in the gaps in the trees. Okay, so I think this is a pretty good image. I'm getting the sense that it's just perhaps a little bit low in the frame, so I might just raise that a little bit just for a sense of more balance. And I am picking up that cloud in the bottom left hand corner, which is something that I'm enjoying now, so I'll just apply that. Okay, and of course you probably want to finish off any edit just to make sure you've got a nice black point and a white point. So I'll hold down the option key and get the white slider, and then just drag that until I see some clipping. I dare say snow on the mountains will clip first there, and we come back to ensure we don't lose any detail in those tones, and also check the blacks, and I can come down a little bit but not too much, because we'll get some clipping in the darker foliage of the trees, and that might encourage me just to lower the exposure slider just a little bit. Okay, so once I'm happy with that, I can do a Command N or Control N on a PC, and I'll call that my edit version 2 and hit the create. So there it is, a landscape quick edit. Generally some of these things should only take 3 or 4 minutes once you're clear on what tools you need to get you to where you're going. Okay, so I'll move on to the next edit. I got a very positive response to this image that I captured of a striated heron who was fishing on the side of a bank. Managed to get a high vantage point looking over on top of him, so it was just a matter of time before he made a lunge for one of the fish. You can probably just make out some of the very small fish just below the surface of the water. Now I was using my action settings 1/2000th of a second. In hindsight, probably 1 1/4000th of a second would be better, but of course the ISO is already at 1250, so it's a little bit of a compromise. Do you shoot something at 2500 ISO and get more noise, or do you get a little bit of subject blur? Of course the wings move so rapidly. The wing in the foreground in the lower portion of the image is not pin sharp. I do have sharp focus on the wing on the top of the image. Anyway, I think it's all about the decisive moment. So you can see my info on the top left hand corner for those settings, again using the 100-400 lens. So let's hit the reset button. We'll go into the develop module first, and then we'll hit the reset and show you how I could edited this image from scratch. So we'll just hit reset, and just a small delay while it resets. Okay, obviously not quite so much drama, not so much contrast in this image. So we'll take a look at the basic panel. Now the white balance is as shot, and now possibly the blues weren't quite so vivid in this shot, because if we were to look at the daylight color white balance, you'll see the whole thing is a little bit warm, but this actually looks too warm to me, so I've taken the temperature down. That does have the impact of enhancing the blues, of course. I want to enhance the blues even more by pushing the vibrance slider maybe all the way up to 50. I'm going to take that temperature slider down a little bit more. Okay, so I'm feeling comfortable with that now, maybe a little bit more on the tint as well. Okay, so I'm not really being super faithful to the colors of the bird in this instance. I'm really getting the complementary colors of the warm water and the blue of the feathers really firing here. Next thing we'll do is we'll go into the crop overlay. Go a little bit tighter here. You can see it's already framed quite well, but I'll just go in a little bit tighter, again using the golden ratio overlay, although it's not guiding me that much. I'm just trying to create a tighter frame here. One of the things that I might like to do is push that contrast higher. Okay, now there is a little bit noise being 1250, so rather than applying clarity or texture globally, I think I will just apply that locally with an adjustment brush. Let's just double click the word effect, go for a little bit of clarity 10 and some texture maybe 25 or so, and over the hero part, which is that for me anyway, it's that wing at the top, just put a little bit more drama, maybe even a little bit of contrast as well. Okay, that's really popping for me now, and I'll just come out of that adjustment brush. I'm going to darken the corners here by coming into the effects panel and dragging and putting a vignette into that, maybe as much as -30 there. Okay, so that's almost done, I think. We've got a little bit of a bright leg, I've noticed, so I'll just again coming into that adjustment brush, -2/3 of a stop. I'll need a much smaller brush this time, and I'll just brush that down the leg there just to darken that leg, so it's not quite so bright. Now there are quite a few flecks in the water, but I could spend probably 10-15 minutes using this, the spot removal tool, so I might do that in Photoshop. But before we go there, there's also a little bit of noise or texture in the water. If we go in and zoom in to let's say 100%, and then I'll just hit the space bar, you'll see there's a little bit of texture in the water here, which I want a little bit smoother, so I'm just going to go back into that adjustment brush. I'll zoom out a little bit, and we'll go with the adjustment brush and double click on the word effect, and now I'll come down to noise removal and also a little bit less texture, and I'm going to go into the water area. This is where I do want the auto mask selected, because I'm going to stay behind the edge of the wings here, and I'll just brush that around the water, and just going all the way around just to get rid of any excess texture in that water there, and also in this lower edge. Now I could confirm that by clicking in the tools bar at the bottom and just see whether any more work needs to be done. I'll probably just go out right out there and come down into the corner. And you see the auto mask is working quite well. It is staying behind the wingtips there, and so I can paint really quite quickly with this tool with the auto mask on. I don't use it when dodging and burning, and I've got more gradual transitions of tone, because you can get some unnatural sort of steps or edges in amongst that smooth tone. So that will suffice, maybe just in that corner there, just at the back of the neck. If I manage to go over any of the edges, I can just hold down the Option key and just clean up, just to restore detail if that brush has gone over the edges, which it has done on that wing tip there. Okay, so now that I'm happy with that, I'll just come out of that adjustment brush. As I said, there's quite a few specks and also some highlights on the bank, which I find just a little bit distracting. So I'll right click and choose to edit in Photoshop 2021. That might take a minute or two for Photoshop to launch and open, because this is obviously a 50 megapixel file that we're going out in. While it's doing that, I'll just take a look at the Lightroom Classic preferences here. So you can see that the external editing, I've got the color space set to Adobe RGB, and if you want to edit faster inside of Photoshop, drop the bit depth from 16 to 8. I do recommend staying at 16 if you're going to do large amounts of color or tonal editing in Photoshop, but I'm not. So an 8-bit color depth is fine, because I've done all of the heavy lifting inside of Lightroom. So I'll just close that down and switch over to Photoshop. So that should be ready to go. Okay, so here is the bird open inside of Photoshop. What I'll do is I'll just right click and choose Convert to Smart Object. And again, will take a few seconds. I've got some background activities also working on the computer. If your speed starts slowing down, it is worth closing all of the other applications, just so you got a maximum amount of RAM available for Lightroom and Photoshop. So let's we'll come in with a filter. I have used this filter in this same seminar, so it is of course the dust and scratches. So we go Noise, Dust and Scratches. This was a favorite tool when we used to scan film, but now it's just great for removing lots of specks that would just take too long inside of Lightroom. So Dust and Scratches, let's just you can see that the water is already very smooth. I'll just zoom in and see how smooth that is. Okay, and of course all of those little specks that we did have with the radius set to 0 or all gone. As we zoom in, you can probably just make out the small fish below the surface of the water, which is quite cute. So we're looking at a radius that will just get rid of these specks. So here I'm choosing 7. You will still want a little bit of threshold here, just to get a little bit of texture back without the dust and specks. So that's just about right here. So I'll just apply OK. And what we'll do is we'll just invert, because we don't want to lose the detail in the feather structure. So I'll just invert that mask, and then I'll select the brush tool, press the B on the keyboard, select the brush tool, make sure you've got white selected as the foreground color. You can press the D key for defaults, and you can cycle between black and white by just pressing the X key. I'll want to go in with white with quite a large brush, so I'm just using that closed square bracket key, and then just moving around that water just to clean up any specks that we might find in the water that we don't want. And most of the specks that I'm looking to get rid of are actually in this I know they're highlights off the wet rocks here, but I just find them just a little bit distracting, to be honest. So they're all going. Can you imagine how long that would take with the spot removal tool inside of Lightroom? Okay, and so that is good. Obviously a larger speck like that won't go. It can reduce but won't go. So what I'll do is I'll just click on layer 0, click on add another layer. We'll come in with the spot healing brush. This works much faster than the one in Lightroom, and just click and gone, and again click, and this time drag, get a little bit of replacement texture. This works much faster, as I said, than Lightroom, and we'll just do some spotting there to get rid of these small distractions, and that really completes the job. I'll just zoom back out, make sure that we're all good to go, and then just do Command S for save, saving in the default location to ensure that it gets reloaded back into Lightroom, and then close the file and come back over to Lightroom, and there is the edited file. And if I go into grid view, the edited file is sitting alongside the original. Okay, so that concludes that wildlife edit. In the final edit for this seminar, we'll take a look at this landscape image that I captured in far north tropical Queensland. We're in Port Douglas, and what you see there is the sugar wharf with a passing Chinese junk there. Obviously there's a great need for people visiting this area to get out to the Great Barrier Reef, and so there's all manner of ships and vessels taking tourists out, either for sunset cruises or for going scuba diving, etc., etc. So let's take a look at the info panel as well in the top left hand corner. Some of the very observant amongst you might notice this doesn't quite align with my PAL workflow, portrait action landscape. Now I'm shooting handheld, and I have been shooting some portraits just to the back of the beach where I'm standing, and I've moved down and I've actually grabbed this shot quite quickly, and I'm still in portrait mode. Which is the reason why you see the shutter speed at 1/250th of a second, which is my portrait settings, and an ISO that's slightly raised to 125. In order to grab this shot quickly, rather than move the shoot mode dial, it appears I've just rolled the aperture down from maybe maximum aperture f1.4 on this G master lens to f16. Now, because this is quite a hurried capture, because the passing junk took me by surprise, this was obviously the decision I made, rather than turning the shoot mode dial. In some instances I might just have turned the shoot mode dial to number 3. Now obviously having lenses with the aperture ring on the lens does override anything that you dial in on the memory setting. So if I'd been using f1.4 on the lens, I just would have rolled that down to f16. Now again, people who are familiar with my PAL workflow would probably note that I shoot my starting point for landscapes at f11, and that's what would have been selected had I turned the shoot mode dial to 3 and the aperture ring had been turned to A, which allows the memory to control the aperture. So in this instance, f16 for a 35mm is a safe decision to make, because we don't get quite as much depth of fields as when we're using, say, 24 and 20mm and 16mm focal lengths, where often I'd be choosing the hyperfocal distance. So f16 just gives me that much more depth of field to ensure that I get that foreground subject matter on the beach there in sharp focus. Okay, enough about the image. Let's go and make the edit. So we'll hit the reset, and of course, as you can see, it's a grab shot. I've not even managed to get the image straight. I do have a habit of getting slightly skewed images when I'm in a bit of a rush, but of course we can straighten that in post. So that's the first thing that I'm going to do. I don't have any particular order when I'm editing. The way I approach an image is I start fixing the things that annoy me most first. There is no linear way of editing in a program such as Lightroom Classic or Lightroom CC. So I'll just drag that straight. I'm looking at the horizon line on that grid that helps me straighten an image. I'm also looking at the uprights on the sugar wharf there to get a sense of when this is straight. Okay, so now sometimes I will choose a 16:9 aspect ratio for my landscape images, but I'm cutting off some of the foreground and some of the light rays coming from behind the clouds. So in this instance I'll stick with the native aspect ratio of the sensor, which is 3:2. So we'll just commit that. I can press the R on the keyboard to commit that. Now the shadows are slightly underexposed because I'm lowering the exposure in order to protect the very bright highlights we can see of the sun directly behind these clouds. So what I'm going to do is, my starting point for the Alpha 7C does have plus 60, but I'm tempted to raise that much higher. I don't fear about using the maximum settings on these sliders. The raw file format is very forgiving for quite aggressive edits, especially in landscape. So the landscape setting would normally have uncompressed raw as well, and so I might be slightly compromised if I hadn't turned the shoot mode dial to 3, because I would typically be shooting portraits in compressed raw, so there would have been something to be said in retrospect about certainly moving that shoot mode dial to 3 rather than just changing the aperture. Okay, so let's take a look at my next edit. Okay, so the sky is a little bit light on the top, so I'm going to add a graduated filter. I'll double click the word effect just to zero all of the sliders, and I'll drag that down to maybe -1.5 stops, and then drag that down over the top of the image. Now I might drag that a little bit lower. Now you can see the light rays here are losing a little bit of their brightness, so we're not restricted just to moving one slider here. For instance, I could move the whites or the highlights brighter in order to restore those, and that would encourage me then to lower the exposure even further. I can also drag the white balance to blue to get a richer blue in that sky above the clouds, which is something that I prefer. I can also make more of these light rays by dragging up the clarity slider, as you can see there, and again I might push the exposure slider even further down to -2. Okay, so that is a good example of using multiple adjustments on a single graduated filter, and really I was looking at those light rays and be guided by what's happening on screen rather than just concentrating the numbers in the panel. Now that I've got that one, I will just click on the new. I'm going to add a graduated filter from the bottom of the image. I often darken the base of an image when doing these landscape graduated filters, but the foreground is already quite dark. So when I drag this slider, I don't really want that darkening effect there, so I'm just going to double click the word effect. I really want to make the foreground maybe a little bit warmer, okay, to reflect the warmth in the sun here, but I also want to protect the really dark shadow tones. So I'm going to turn this to the luminance and just drag the range up, so that if I do darken this foreground, we're not going to be crushing those shadow tones of this on the foreground beach there. So I'm just going to drag that a little bit higher because I want the warmth on the reflections on the foreground beach there. Now I'm going to come over to the radial filters. Okay, again double clicking the word effect. I'm going to have like a -1 stop exposure just as a starting point. I might adjust that later. We've got a little bit of clipping there. You can see in the clouds, if I click on the show highlight clipping, we're just losing a little bit of detail here. So I'm just going to drag that over the cloud formation here. Okay, so again, I've got a little bit of a darkening on the top of the clouds there, so I might come in with the brush here, hold down the Option or Alt key, and I'll increase the size of the brush, and I'll wipe off any sort of adjustments just to the top of those clouds. I do want those light rays being very bright. Now I'm just going to, I don't need quite so much darkening, I don't think, so I'll just wind that back maybe to half a stop. You can see we've got no clipping now occurring, or just very minimal clipping, and so that is probably enough for what I want to do. Now if I go over to the basic panel and just increase the warmth of this image to reflect the sun that is getting very low in the sky, you'll see that I can make a very warm central part of the image, but the sugar warp is still very blue in the shadows. What we typically find in shadows is they're lit by predominantly skylight, blue light, and so they can be very cold or even exaggerated compared to what we remember them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to that radial filter, double click the word effect, and I'm going to just create a warm radial filter in order to correct the coolness of that sugar warp, the tones or colors in there. I'm also going to just kick a little bit of brightness as well. You might see that there's a couple standing on the beach. This is a wedding, a bride and groom here, having some photographs taken on the beach. I can't see where the photographer is. He's probably off out of frame to the left there. This sugar warp now no longer serves the purpose of shipping sugarcane. It actually is used as a wedding reception center for like 200 days of the year. People use this very romantic spot to get married. Okay, so as you can see that the warmth in this slider, if I just drag that up, you can see that's correcting the cold blue sugar warp here. And again, just adding, maybe opening up some shadows just to give a little bit more information into that section of the image. I'm really just being driven by what I want you to be more aware of as I'm editing the image. And of course, whenever we edit an image like this, there's never going to be two edits exactly the same. You're always going to be driven by the ideas at that particular time of editing. Now I think I've pretty much finished that image. A couple of things that happen automatically for me that you may want to check in your version of Lightroom are things like the detail. I have that set as a default of increased sharpening, so rather than take the default of 40, I've got an automatic sharpening because I've overridden the developed default. So we've got 75, and on the masking 75 as well. And one of the other things that is happening automatically is I will have a small vignette. You will notice the corners are slightly darker. If that is not something that you want, you would possibly push that back to ensure that you've got continuous even tone across the top of the sky. But I actually quite like corners a little bit darker, which is why my default is -10 rather than 0 there. Okay, so that basically sums up this edit. Oh, well, there's one more thing I should mention is in the lens correction panel. I have my lens corrections being applied automatically. Now, this being a G Master lens, I suspect there is very little lens corrections that need to be applied to a G Master wide-angle lens. So, but you'll probably find that if you're not using G Master glass and you are using wide-angle lenses, you will need to enable the profile corrections to correct any barrel or pincushion distortion. We often find barrel distortion on wide-angle lenses and pincushion distortion on telephotos. So I'll just click off that enable profile corrections, and such a minimal amount of corrections being applied, which is what you would expect with a G Master glass. There is usually very little that needs to be done with G Master glass because the optics of the lens is so good that corrections are often minimal. But you will find this especially with telephoto zooms as well, and wide angle say cheaper lenses. You will be looking to pick up those profile corrections. I can also mention that you'll have this little eye built-in lens profile attached. We do have options in the Sony cameras to apply some lens corrections in the camera. Some of these get applied to RAW, but we usually only find the chromatic aberration is corrected. We don't actually get the lens distortions corrected. So it doesn't really matter if you're applying the lens corrections twice for chromatic aberration, but you certainly want to be looking for any distortion whilst doing this. We can of course do manual correction with these sliders here if you find that your lens profile hasn't done a 100% accurate job. Okay, so hopefully you've enjoyed these final edits and also me discussing about the camera settings I've used to capture these images that I've been talking about. And I'll certainly do more of these seminars as they are proving very popular, where I give you access to the raw files and allow you to follow along with the edits. And of course you're always free to do your own interpretations. I just ask that you don't actually share these images on social media online, because they are copyrighted to Sony, being a Sony ambassador. Okay, so thanks for I'd hopefully you've enjoyed this seminar, and I'll cook up some new subject content for next month. Okay, I'll catch you online next time.